December 20th, 1943. The winter sky above Bremen, Germany, hung heavy with the promise of death. At 27,000 feet, where the air grew thin enough to steal a man's consciousness in seconds, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress with hands that had long since lost their feeling. The cold at this altitude wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was a living thing, creeping through flight suits, settling into bones, turning breath into clouds of ice crystals that froze against oxygen masks. His bomber, which the crew had nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was dying around him. The mission had seemed straightforward that morning when Brown and his crew received their briefing at Kimbolton Air Base in England. Their target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft manufacturing facilities in Bremen, a crucial component of the German war machine. It was Brown's first mission as an aircraft commander, a fact that had filled him with equal parts pride and terror as he'd walked across the frozen English airfield in the pre-dawn darkness. The veteran pilots had offered him grim nods of acknowledgement, the kind of silent respect given to men about to face their baptism by fire. The formation of 120 B-17s had crossed the English Channel in textbook precision, an aerial armada that stretched across miles of sky. Brown had marveled at the sight. Hundreds of aircraft moving in synchronized harmony, each one carrying 10 men whose lives depended on maintaining formation. The Flying Fortress had earned its name through sheer defensive firepower, but that power only worked when the bombers stayed together, creating interlocking fields of machine gun fire that could shred attacking fighters. Everything had unraveled over Bremen. The German flak batteries had opened up with terrifying accuracy, filling the sky with black clouds of exploding shrapnel. Each burst represented tons of steel fragments moving at supersonic speeds, capable of shredding aluminum skin and human flesh with equal indifference. Brown had watched in horror as bombers around him took direct hits, some exploding in massive fireballs, others spinning toward Earth trailing smoke and debris. Then the Luftwaffe fighters had arrived, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190As, flown by pilots who had honed their skills against the best the Allies could offer. They came in waves, attacking from every angle, exploiting any gap in the formation. Brown's bomber had been hit multiple times during the bomb run. Shrapnel had punctured the fuselage, destroyed the No. 2 engine, and wounded several crew members. The tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, had taken the worst of it, his position shredded by cannon fire. The real nightmare began during the return flight. A Focke-Wulf had made a head-on attack, its cannons raking the bomber from nose to tail. The plexiglass nose cone had shattered, exposing the bombardier to the screaming wind. The No. 3 engine erupted in flames before the crew managed to extinguish it. Worse still, the attack had knocked Ye Olde Pub out of formation, leaving her isolated and vulnerable, precisely what every bomber crew feared most. Now, as Brown struggled to maintain altitude with only 2 functioning engines, he watched the rest of his formation disappearing toward the horizon. They were alone in hostile skies, wounded prey separated from the herd. Every man aboard knew what that meant. According to records maintained by the mighty 8th Air Force Historical Society, isolated bombers rarely survived encounters with enemy fighters. The statistics were brutal. A separated B-17's chances of reaching England dropped below 20%. Brown keyed his intercom, trying to sound calm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Navigator, give me a heading for home. Gunners, keep your eyes open. They'll be coming for us." He had no idea how right he was, or how wrong his assumptions about what came next would prove to be. Lieutenant Franz Steigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 had already claimed 2 bomber kills that morning when he spotted the crippled B-17 limping across the German countryside. From his Messerschmitt Bf-109, the American bomber looked like a wounded bird, struggling to maintain altitude, trailing smoke from damaged engines. It was the kind of target every fighter pilot dreamed of, an easy kill that would bring him one step closer to the Knight's Cross. At 27 years old, Franz Steigler was no ordinary pilot. He had logged combat hours in North Africa, Sicily, and now over the Reich itself. With 27 confirmed victories, he stood just 3 kills away from earning Germany's highest military honor. The Iron Cross First Class already hung at his throat, earned through countless engagements where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. His commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, had pulled him aside that morning with words that echoed in his mind. "One more good day, Stiegler, and you'll have your Knight's Cross." Stiegler pushed his throttle forward, closing the distance to the stricken bomber. Through his gun sight, he could see the American aircraft in devastating detail. The nose was shattered, exposing the interior to the elements. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese, riddled with holes from flak and cannon fire. One engine was completely dead, another struggling to produce power. It should have been a textbook kill. A quick burst from his 20mm cannons, and another American bomber would spiral into the German countryside. But as Stiegler pulled alongside the B-17, something made him hesitate. Through the massive holes in the fuselage, he could see inside the bomber. What he witnessed stopped him cold. Wounded crew members were trying desperately to care for each other. One man was slumped over his gun, clearly dead or unconscious. Another was trying to apply bandages with hands that shook from cold and fear. The tail gunner's position was completely destroyed, the metal twisted into grotesque shapes by cannon fire. Stiegler's mind raced back 7 years to a conversation with his commanding officer during his initial fighter training. Gustav Rödel had been more than a commanding officer. He had been a mentor, a man who fought by a code even in the midst of total war. His words had been burned into Stiegler's memory. "Honor is everything, Stiegler. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. We are fighter pilots, not murderers." The German pilot maneuvered his Messerschmitt closer, positioning himself where the American crew could see him clearly. He could see the bomber's pilot looking at him, waiting for the burst of cannon fire that would end everything. Stiegler studied the man's face through the shattered cockpit, young, terrified, exhausted, but still fighting to control his damaged aircraft. This wasn't a military target anymore. This was a flying coffin, held together by courage and desperation, crewed by men who had already paid a terrible price. A decision crystallized in Franz Stiegler's mind, one that would have seemed impossible minutes earlier. He began making hand gestures toward the American pilot, trying to communicate across the barrier of nationality and language. "Fly toward Sweden," he tried to signal. "Get to neutral territory. Land in Sweden where you'll be interned but alive." According to historical accounts documented by the American Fighter Aces Association, Sweden had become an unofficial sanctuary for damaged Allied aircraft, a place where crews could survive the war, even if they couldn't return home. But the American pilot either didn't understand or refused to acknowledge the signals. Brown kept his battered bomber pointed west, toward England, toward home. Stiegler could understand that impulse, the desperate need to reach friendly territory, to get his wounded men to proper medical care, to complete the mission despite the odds. Every instinct in the German pilot's training told him to complete his attack, to claim his kill, to move one step closer to the Knight's Cross that represented the pinnacle of Luftwaffe achievement. Instead, Franz Stiegler made a choice that defied every military regulation, every tactical consideration, every career aspiration. He moved his fighter into a position on the bomber's wing, matching its speed, adopting a protective escort formation. If the American wouldn't go to Sweden, then Stiegler would do something even more audacious. He would escort this enemy bomber to the coast, shielding it from other German fighters, using his presence to create a zone of safety around the crippled B-17. The crew of Ye Olde pub watched in stunned disbelief as the German fighter moved into formation beside them. Staff Sergeant Alex Yelisanko, manning one of the waist guns, had his finger on the trigger, but something in the enemy pilot's body language stopped him from firing. Through the holes in the fuselage, with the wind screaming past at 200 miles per hour, the American gunners found themselves in the most surreal moment of their lives, flying in formation with an enemy who could kill them at any moment. Charlie Brown's mind struggled to process what was happening. His training had covered every conceivable combat scenario: engine failures, fire, flak damage, fighter attacks. But nothing had prepared him for this. The Messerschmitt pilot was close enough that Brown could see his face, see the Iron Cross decoration on his uniform, see the human being behind the enemy. The German was making gestures again, pointing down, then toward the coast. The message was clear even without words. "Don't try to fight, just keep flying, I'll get you to the sea." The bombardier, Staff Sergeant Sam Blackford, had managed to pull himself back from the shattered nose section, his face bloody from flying plexiglass fragments. He stared at the German fighter with the expression of a man who had crossed into some alternate reality. "Lieutenant," he called over the intercom, his voice shaking. "What's he doing? Why isn't he shooting?" Brown had no answer. In the rear of the aircraft, the wounded tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, drifted in and out of consciousness, mercifully unaware of the impossible drama unfolding outside. The top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Petchout, kept his guns trained on the Messerschmitt but held his fire. Every man aboard the bomber understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that transcended the usual rules of combat. Franz Stiegler flew with intense concentration, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for threats. He knew exactly what he was risking. If any other German fighter pilot spotted him escorting an American bomber, his career would be over. Worse, he could face a court-martial for dereliction of duty, possibly even execution. The Luftwaffe High Command had become increasingly ruthless as the war turned against Germany. Officers who showed mercy to the enemy were viewed as traitors, particularly in late 1943 when the bombing campaign against German cities had intensified. They flew on across the winter landscape of Germany, an impossible formation of enemies bound by a moment of humanity. Below them, the German countryside stretched out in patches of snow and shadow. Towns and cities bore the scars of war. Bombed factories, damaged rail lines, the infrastructure of a nation under siege. Stiegler knew that the bomber he was protecting had likely contributed to that destruction. The B-17 had bombed German targets, killed German civilians, advanced the Allied campaign to destroy the Third Reich. By every rational calculation, he should complete his attack, but rationality had nothing to do with his decision. Stiegler's older brother August had been a Luftwaffe pilot killed on the Russian front in 1941. His younger brother, also a pilot, had been shot down and wounded over France. Franz Stiegler understood the fragility of life at war, the razor-thin line between survival and death. Looking at the wounded Americans struggling in their crippled bomber, he saw not enemies but fellow airmen, men who had drawn the same impossible duty of flying into hostile skies where death waited at every altitude. As they approached the German coastline, Stiegler made another series of gestures. He pointed forcefully toward England, then made a diving motion with his hand. "Stay low over the water," he was trying to communicate. "Fly at wave-top level, where German coastal radar can't track you effectively." According to operational records from the German Air Defense Command, low-altitude flights across the North Sea had the best chance of evading detection, though they came with their own risks. Navigation difficulties, structural stress on damaged aircraft, and the constant danger of hitting the water. Brown watched the gestures and slowly nodded, understanding dawning despite the language barrier. The German pilot waggled his wings one final time, a fighter pilot's salute that transcended nationality. Then he pulled away, his Messerschmitt banking sharply and disappearing back toward the German interior. He had escorted them as far as he dared. The rest was up to Brown and his crew. In the cockpit of Ye Old Pub, Charlie Brown sat in stunned silence for several seconds. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the wind and engine noise. "Did that really just happen? Did a German fighter pilot just save our lives?" Brown had no answer because he didn't fully believe it himself. But the evidence was undeniable. They were alive, approaching the coast, with a chance of making it home because an enemy had chosen mercy over duty. He pushed the yoke forward, beginning the descent toward the gray waters of the North Sea, following the instructions of the man who should have killed them. The North Sea in December stretched before them like a sheet of hammered lead, cold and merciless. Charlie Brown kept Ye Old Pub at wave-top level, sometimes flying so low that spray from the Whitecaps misted the belly of the bomber. It was terrifying flying, requiring total concentration, but it kept them below the German radar. With only 2 engines producing reliable power, every mile toward England felt like a miracle. Inside the bomber, the crew worked with the desperate efficiency of men who knew survival depended on their actions. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Al Sadak, hunched over his charts despite the wind tearing through the fuselage, calculating their heading to the nearest English airfield. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Richard Petchout, tried repeatedly to raise British coastal stations, but the radio had been damaged in the attack. They were flying blind, trusting navigation and luck. The wounded needed constant attention. The engineer, Staff Sergeant Sam Blackford, despite his own injuries, moved through the aircraft checking on the other men. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, had finally regained consciousness, his face pale with blood loss. The waist gunner, Sergeant Alex Yelisanko, had taken shrapnel in his leg but refused morphine, afraid of losing consciousness. These were kids, most of them barely into their 20s, thrust into circumstances that would break older men. Brown's arms ached from fighting the controls. With the hydraulic system damaged, every adjustment required physical force. The bomber wanted to roll to the right, pulled by the dead engines on that side. Maintaining level flight was like arm wrestling an invisible opponent who never tired. His co-pilot, Spencer Luke, helped when he could, but the damage to the flight control systems meant that sometimes 2 men's strength was barely enough. The fuel situation was becoming critical. One of the German attacks had punctured several fuel tanks, and they'd been leaking aviation gasoline for over an hour. Sadok had calculated they had maybe 45 minutes of flying time remaining, possibly less. If they didn't reach England soon, they'd be swimming in the North Sea where survival time in the December water was measured in minutes. The ditching statistics for B-17s were grim. The aircraft was nose-heavy and tended to break apart on water impact. Then, through the haze and sea spray, the English coast appeared. It looked like a mirage at first, a darker line on the horizon that might have been cloud or wishful thinking. But as they drew closer, the coastline solidified into reality. The white cliffs, the green fields beyond, the blessed sight of home territory. A ragged cheer went up over the intercom, the sound of men who had expected to die and found themselves granted a reprieve. But they weren't safe yet. Brown had no idea where they were along the English coast, and with the radio dead, he couldn't call ahead to warn any airfield of their approach. They needed to land immediately, before the fuel ran out or the damaged aircraft simply fell apart. He scanned the countryside below, searching for anything that looked like an airbase. According to post-mission reports filed with the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, Ye Old Pub appeared without warning over RAF Seething in Norfolk, a base normally used by B-24 Liberators. The ground crews looked up in shock as the battered B-17 made its approach. Half the vertical stabilizer missing, nose blown out, engines streaming smoke, flying on what looked like sheer willpower. Brown lined up for landing, but immediately realized they had a problem. The hydraulics were completely gone now, which meant no landing gear. They would have to belly land, sliding the bomber in on her skin. He'd practiced emergency landings during training, but never in an aircraft this damaged, never with wounded men aboard depending on him to get it right. He keyed the intercom one last time. "Brace for impact. We're going in without gear. Get away from the windows and hold on to something solid." The crew scrambled to secure themselves. In the tail section, despite his wounds, Eckenrode wrapped himself in whatever padding he could find, preparing for the violent stop that was coming. Brown took a deep breath, said a prayer to a god he'd been talking to a lot that day, and brought Ye Old Pub in. The bomber hit the grass runway with a grinding screech of metal on earth, sparks flying as the damaged belly scraped along the ground. The aircraft slewed sideways, threatened a cartwheel, but Brown fought the controls with everything he had. Slowly, agonizingly, the bomber ground to a halt in a cloud of torn grass and dirt. For several seconds, nobody moved. They'd survived the mission, survived the attack, survived the impossible escort, survived the North Sea crossing, and survived the landing. It seemed too much luck for one crew on one day. Then the crew began moving, helping each other out of the wreck, getting the wounded to the medics who were running toward them across the field. Charlie Brown climbed out of the pilot's seat on legs that barely supported him, emerging through the shattered nose section into the cold English afternoon. A ground crew chief walked up to him, staring at the wreckage in disbelief. The officer counted over 200 holes in the fuselage. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, "I have no idea how you flew this thing home. It shouldn't be possible." Brown thought about the German fighter pilot, about the escort that had given them a chance, about the mercy shown by an enemy. But when the intelligence officers arrived for debriefing, he said nothing about it. How could he explain what had happened? Who would believe that a German pilot had spared them, escorted them to safety, chosen humanity over duty? He ordered his crew to remain silent about that part of the mission. Some things, he decided, were too impossible to report. In the debriefing room at RAF Seething, Charlie Brown faced a row of intelligence officers who looked at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to suspicion. The lead interrogator, a major whose name Brown immediately forgot due to exhaustion, paced back and forth while reviewing the mission report. The story Brown told, the Bremen raid, the fighter attacks, the damage, the desperate flight home, was extraordinary enough. But he left out the most extraordinary part. "You're telling me," the major said slowly, "that after being attacked by multiple German fighters, you somehow made it back across Germany and the North Sea without further incident? That no other fighters engaged you during your return flight?" Brown nodded, keeping his face neutral. "Yes, sir. We stayed low, used cloud cover when available. We were lucky." The word felt like ash in his mouth. Luck had nothing to do with it. Mercy, courage, honor. Those words felt more appropriate, but they weren't terms usually applied to German fighter pilots in military debriefings. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. They clearly sensed something was being left unsaid, but they had no framework to understand what. The idea that a German pilot would escort a damaged American bomber to safety was so far outside their operational experience that they couldn't conceive of it as a possibility. Eventually, they dismissed Brown and his crew, filing the mission as another example of extraordinary survival against the odds. Charlie Brown walked out of that debriefing room carrying a secret that weighed heavier than any bomb load he'd ever hauled over Germany. In the barracks that night, he pulled his crew together in a quiet corner. They sat in a circle, these young men who had shared an experience that transcended war, and Brown looked each of them in the eye. "What we saw today," he said quietly, "what that German pilot did for us, we don't talk about it. Not to other crews, not to officers, not in letters home. Do you understand?" He saw confusion in some faces, understanding in others. "If we report this, they'll think we're making it up, or worse. They'll think we collaborated with the enemy somehow. That pilot saved our lives by breaking his own military code. The least we can do is protect him by staying silent." The crew nodded, sealing a pact of silence that would last decades. They understood, in the way that combat veterans understand certain truths, that some acts of humanity are too fragile to expose to the machinery of war. Speaking about the German pilot's mercy might endanger him if word somehow reached the Luftwaffe command. Worse, it might cheapen what had happened, reduce it to a curiosity or a propaganda tool. Franz Stiegler faced his own reckoning back at his base in Germany. When he landed after the mission, his commander, Gustav Rodel, immediately noticed something wrong. Stiegler had been airborne during a period when multiple Allied bombers were engaged, yet he returned without claiming any victories. Rodel called him into his office, closing the door behind them. "Franz," Rodel said carefully, "you were up there for nearly 2 hours. What happened?" Stiegler stood at attention, mind racing. He could lie, claim mechanical problems, say he'd lost sight of targets in clouds. But Rodel had always been honest with him, had been the one to teach him that honor mattered even in war. Stiegler made a decision. "Sir, I encountered a badly damaged B-17. The crew was already wounded, the aircraft barely flying. I could not bring myself to shoot at them. Instead, I escorted them toward the coast." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Rodel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, concern, and finally something that might have been understanding. He stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the airfield for a long moment. When he turned back, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What you did, Franz, could be considered treason. If anyone else learns of this, you could face a firing squad." He paused, letting that sink in. "Therefore, this conversation never happened. You were engaged with enemy fighters, expended ammunition, returned to base. That's what the mission report will say. Do you understand?" Stiegler nodded, relief flooding through him. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Rodel walked over and placed a hand on Stiegler's shoulder. "I taught you to fight with honor. I won't punish you for listening. But Franz, You can never do anything like this again. The Gestapo is watching everyone now, looking for defeatists and traitors. Next time, you may not be lucky enough to have only me to answer to." The German pilot left that office carrying his own secret, his own burden of silence. He had saved 10 men's lives by violating every military regulation and career aspiration. He would never receive his Knight's Cross. He needed 3 more confirmed kills. But after December 20th, 1943, Franz Stiegler found he had lost his appetite for adding to his tally. According to Luftwaffe records preserved in the Bundesarchiv Military Archives in Freiburg, Stiegler's victory count remained frozen at 27 for the rest of the war. Both men went on with their lives, separated by an ocean and the vast machinery of war, carrying the memory of one impossible moment when humanity had trumped orders, when mercy had been stronger than military duty. Neither spoke of it to anyone. The war ground on, consuming millions more lives, reshaping the world. The secret of what happened in the sky above Germany remained locked away, a story that seemed too impossible to tell. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. But for Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler, peace brought no answers, only more questions. Brown returned to the United States, trying to build a civilian life while carrying memories that woke him in the middle of the night. He'd dream of the frozen sky over Bremen, the sound of cannon fire ripping through metal, and most vividly, the face of the German pilot who had saved his life. A face he would never forget but thought he would never see again. Brown tried to move forward. He married, started a family, worked various jobs, attempting to find purpose in a world that no longer needed bomber pilots. But the memory of that day haunted him. At veteran reunions, he would listen to other B-17 pilots tell their war stories, harrowing tales of combat, narrow escapes, lost friends. He would nod and share some of his own experiences, but never the whole truth. The secret remained locked away, protected by the promise he'd made to his crew. Across the Atlantic, Franz Stiegler faced an even more difficult peace. Germany lay in ruins, divided between victorious powers, its cities reduced to rubble. Stiegler found himself in a country that wanted to forget the war, that viewed Luftwaffe pilots with complicated emotions, respect for their courage, shame for what they'd fought for, uncertainty about their place in the new Germany. He kept his head down, worked as a commercial pilot when opportunities arose, and never spoke about the war except in the most general terms. The years passed. 1950s, 60s, 70s. Both men aged, their lives following separate paths on different continents. Brown eventually moved to Florida, enjoying retirement, spending time with grandchildren, living the peaceful life he'd fought for. But the question never left him. What happened to that German pilot? Had he survived the war? Did he ever think about that December day when he'd chosen mercy? In 1986, more than 4 decades after the incident, Charlie Brown made a decision. He was in his 60s now, old enough to understand that some stories need to be told before they disappear forever. He began researching, reaching out to military historians, contacting veterans organizations, trying to find any trace of the German pilot who had saved his life. It was a nearly impossible task. He didn't know the pilot's name, barely remembered the markings on the Messerschmitt, had only the memory of a face glimpsed briefly through a cockpit window. Brown wrote letters to German veteran associations, describing the incident, asking if anyone knew of a pilot who might have done such a thing. Most letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were polite but unhelpful. Without a name or specific unit designation, finding one pilot among thousands who had served in the Luftwaffe was like searching for a single snowflake in an avalanche. Then, in 1989, Brown decided to go public with his search. He placed a notice in a newsletter published by the 379th Bombardment Group Association, the organization for veterans of his old unit. The notice was simple, almost plaintive. To the German fighter pilot who saved a B-17 crew on December 20th, 1943. I'm trying to locate the pilot who escorted my crippled B-17 to the North Sea. If you're out there, I'd like to thank you. The notice seemed like a long shot. Brown had no real hope that it would lead anywhere. After all, what were the odds that the German pilot had survived the war, that he would somehow see this notice in an American veteran's publication? That he would be willing to come forward after maintaining silence for so many years? Franz Stiegler, living quietly in British Columbia, Canada, where he'd immigrated years earlier, happened to receive that newsletter. A friend who knew he'd been a Luftwaffe pilot thought he might enjoy reading about American veterans' experiences. Stiegler almost threw it away without reading. He'd spent decades trying to move past the war, trying to be just another immigrant making a life in North America. But something made him open it. And there, on one of the back pages, he saw Brown's notice. Stiegler's hands began to shake as he read. For nearly 50 years he had carried the memory of that day. The crippled bomber, the wounded crew visible through the fuselage holes, the decision that had defined his life. He had never spoken of it, even to his wife, fearing judgment, fearing that people wouldn't understand. Now here was proof that the American crew had survived, that his act of mercy had mattered, that after all these years, someone was looking for him. Stiegler sat down and wrote a letter, his English imperfect, but his meaning clear. He described the mission, the encounter, details that only someone who had been there could know. The shattered nose of the bomber, the dead tail gunner position, the gesture he'd made trying to direct them toward Sweden. When Charlie Brown opened that letter several weeks later, his hands shook just as Stiegler's had. Here, after nearly half a century, was the answer to the question that had haunted him. The German pilot had survived. He had made it through the war, emigrated to Canada, built a life. And he remembered every detail, every moment of that impossible encounter. Brown immediately wrote back. Letters flew between Florida and British Columbia, two old warriors comparing memories, filling in gaps, finally able to speak about something they'd both kept secret for so long. The letters revealed much more than just the facts of that day. They revealed the anguish both men had felt about war, about duty versus conscience, about the human capacity for mercy, even in humanity's darkest hours. January 18, 1990. Charlie Brown stood in the arrivals area at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since the war. He was 66 years old, a grandfather, decades removed from the young pilot who had fought to keep a dying bomber in the air over Germany. But at that moment, waiting to meet the man who had saved his life, he felt like that terrified 21-year-old again. The crowd parted, and Brown saw him, Franz Stiegler, walking through the terminal, a tall man with white hair and the bearing of someone who had once commanded the sky. Their eyes met across the crowded airport, and both men froze. For several seconds, they simply stared at each other, 47 years collapsing into nothing. Then Brown walked forward, extending his hand. Stiegler looked at the offered hand, then brushed it aside and pulled Brown into an embrace. Both men had tears streaming down their faces, crying unashamedly in the middle of the busy airport, while travelers hurried past, oblivious to the extraordinary reunion taking place. No words were necessary at first. The embrace said everything: gratitude, forgiveness, recognition, respect. Finally, Stiegler stepped back, his voice thick with emotion. "I've waited so long," he said in accented English. "So many years I wondered if you made it home, if your crew survived. When I saw your letter, I could not believe it was real." Brown's voice was equally unsteady. "I've searched for you for years. I never forgot your face, what you did for us. You saved 10 lives that day." They went to Brown's home where both families gathered, wives, children, grandchildren. The two old warriors sat down with maps and photographs, reconstructing that December day in 1943, with the precision of men for whom those moments were burned into memory. They discovered details that made the encounter even more remarkable. Stiegler described how close he'd come to firing, how he'd had Brown's bomber perfectly lined up in his sights before seeing the wounded crew. Brown explained how his crew had been convinced they were about to die when the Messerschmitt pulled alongside. "Why?" Brown finally asked the question that had haunted him for decades. "Why did you do it? You could have had your Knight's Cross. Instead, you risked everything." Stiegler was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "When I flew next to you, I could see inside your aircraft. I saw men wounded, dying, still trying to care for each other. It was like shooting at a man in a parachute. He looked up, meeting Brown's eyes. My commander taught me that honor matters, even in war. Maybe especially in war. I could not shoot at you, it would have been murder. The two families spent hours together, swapping stories, comparing experiences, marveling at the chain of coincidences that had brought them back together. Stigler's children learned for the first time what their father had done during the war. Brown's grandchildren heard the full story their grandfather had kept secret for so long. The room filled with laughter and tears, with the recognition that humanity could survive even in war's darkest moments. But the reunion went deeper than just one day's story. Both men opened up about their experiences, about the toll the war had taken. Brown spoke of nightmares that had persisted for years, of friends who hadn't made it home, of the moral complexity of dropping bombs on cities where civilians lived. Stigler talked about the shame many Germans felt after the war, about fighting for a cause that had been revealed as monstrous, about the difficulty of reconciling military duty with moral responsibility. I was a fighter pilot, Stigler said at one point. I loved flying, loved the challenge, the skill required, but I never loved killing. After that day with you, I lost my desire to fight. I flew more missions, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I lined up a bomber, I would think, there are men like yours inside. Boys. Somebody's sons and husbands and fathers. Brown nodded slowly. We were all just boys, 20, 21 years old. Old men sent us to kill each other, and somehow we survived long enough to become old men ourselves. The reunion sparked media interest. The story of the German fighter pilot who spared an American bomber became news. Newspapers ran articles, television stations requested interviews, historians suddenly became interested in documenting an incident that had been hidden for decades. According to reports published in the Seattle Times, the story captured public imagination because it offered something rare. A war story about mercy rather than victory, about humanity transcending conflict. Brown and Stigler became close friends, regularly calling each other, visiting when possible, maintaining the connection that had begun in combat and been renewed in peace. They appeared together at schools and veterans events, telling their story, emphasizing the lessons they believed it taught. War is necessary sometimes, they would say, but warriors can still maintain their humanity. Rules and orders matter, but conscience matters more. Even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. The two old pilots collaborated with author Adam Makos on a book about their experience, titled A Higher Call, published in 2012. The book became a bestseller, introducing their story to a new generation. Makos documented not just the incident itself, but the full lives of both men, showing how that one moment of mercy had shaped their subsequent decades, had defined them in ways neither had fully understood until they reunited. At book signings and speaking events, Brown and Stigler presented a powerful image, two former enemies standing side by side, living proof that war doesn't have to destroy every human connection, that morality can survive even in combat's chaos. Young veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan would approach them after events, thanking them for showing that maintaining honor in war was possible, that difficult moral choices could be made even under fire. Stigler often emphasized one point in particular. People think war strips away all choice, that in combat you simply follow orders and training. But that day proved otherwise. I had a choice. Every warrior has choices, even when it seems there are none. We are never just machines following programming. Brown would add, and I had a choice too, to keep silent or to seek the truth. For decades, I chose silence because I thought that protected everyone. But in the end, telling the truth, finding Franz, acknowledging what happened, that was the right choice. Some stories need to be told. The friendship between the two men deepened with each passing year. They spoke on the phone regularly, comparing notes about grandchildren, discussing current events, occasionally falling into reminiscences about that December day. Their wives became friends as well, creating a bond between the families that transcended the old enmity between their nations. Birthdays and holidays were marked with cards and phone calls. The distance between Florida and British Columbia seemed insignificant compared to the connection they shared. In March 2008, Franz Stigler passed away at age 92. Charlie Brown flew to Canada for the funeral, delivering a eulogy that left few dry eyes in the chapel. He spoke of courage, of honor, of a man who had understood that true strength sometimes means refusing to use your power. "Franz saved my life in 1943, Brown said, his voice breaking. "But he gave me something more valuable than survival. He showed me that even in war's darkest moments, humanity endures. He proved that honor and mercy aren't weaknesses. They're the highest forms of courage." Brown returned home carrying grief, but also gratitude. For the last 18 years of Stiegler's life, they had been able to share their story, to speak the truth that had been locked away for so long, to transform a wartime secret into a legacy of hope. The reunion had given both men something they hadn't realized they needed: validation that their choices had mattered, recognition that honor in war was real, and not just propaganda. Charlie Brown lived another 4 years after Stiegler's death, passing away in November 2013 at age 87. His obituary and military publications made prominent mention of the story, ensuring that his final legacy wasn't just about survival, but about humanity. At his funeral, someone read portions of the letters he and Stiegler had exchanged over the years, words of respect, affection, and mutual understanding between men who had every reason to be enemies, but chose friendship instead. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler resonates today not because it's unique, but because it reminds us of possibilities we often forget exist. In an era when war is often portrayed as either glorious or completely dehumanizing, their encounter suggests a third truth: that even in combat's brutality, individual choices matter, moral agency survives, and mercy remains possible. Military historians have examined the incident extensively, using it as a case study in several contexts. The United States Air Force Academy includes the story in ethics courses, asking cadets to consider the complexities both men faced. What obligations do warriors have to their own conscience versus their military orders? When does following orders become morally untenable? How do professional soldiers maintain humanity while executing their deadly duties? The German military academies have similarly incorporated the story into their curriculum. For a German military still grappling with its World War II legacy, Stiegler's choice offers a different narrative than the usual stories of that period. Here was a German officer who fought skillfully but maintained a moral code, who recognized the difference between combat and murder, who understood that honor transcended national loyalty. According to educational materials from the Bundeswehr Command and Staff College, the incident is presented as an example of ethical leadership under extreme pressure. Aviation museums have preserved the story as well. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, includes displays about the incident, featuring photographs of both men, excerpts from their correspondence, and technical details about the damaged B-17. Visitors can see the magnitude of the damage Ye Olde Pub sustained and better understand the miracle of its survival, a miracle that began with an enemy's mercy. The story has inspired numerous artistic interpretations. Filmmakers have sought rights to adapt it, though no major production has yet come to fruition. Artists have created paintings depicting the moment the Messerschmitt pulled alongside the damaged bomber, trying to capture the surreal quality of that encounter. Writers have used it as inspiration for novels exploring themes of honor, duty, and moral choice in war. But perhaps the most important legacy is more personal and difficult to quantify. Thousands of people have encountered the story through the book A Higher Call, through documentaries, through articles and social media posts. Many have written about how it changed their perspective on war, on enemies, on the possibility of moral action in extreme circumstances. Veterans have described how the story helped them process their own wartime experiences, particularly difficult decisions they'd made under fire. The story challenges several comfortable narratives. It complicates the idea that enemies in war are simply evil, suggesting instead that good people can find themselves on opposite sides of conflicts. It questions whether following orders is sufficient moral justification for actions that violate conscience. It demonstrates that remarkable moral courage sometimes means refusing to act, not taking action, and it proves that even decades after war ends, seeking reconciliation and understanding can heal wounds that seemed permanent. Modern military personnel facing deployments in complex environments, where distinguishing combatants from civilians is difficult, where rules of engagement must be applied in split-second decisions, where moral choices have life or death consequences, find the story particularly relevant. Both Brown and Stigler made decisions under extreme pressure with incomplete information. Brown chose to keep flying toward England rather than Sweden, risking his crew for a chance to complete their mission. Stigler chose mercy over duty, risking his career and potentially his life. Neither choice was simple or obviously correct. The families of both men have worked to keep the story alive. Brown's and Stigler's children have appeared at events together, continuing the friendship their fathers forged. They've donated materials to archives and museums, ensuring that future researchers can study the incident in detail. They've participated in documentaries and interviews, providing personal insights into how that December day affected their fathers for the rest of their lives. The broader historical context makes the story even more remarkable. December 1943 was a period of escalating brutality on all fronts. The Holocaust was reaching its murderous peak. Cities across Europe and Asia were being bombed into rubble. The Eastern Front was consuming millions of lives. Prisoners of war were being mistreated and murdered. In this context of mechanized death and ideological hatred, one pilot's decision to spare enemy lives seems almost miraculous. Yet Stigler would have rejected that characterization. In interviews before his death, he consistently downplayed his own role. "I did what any honorable pilot should do," he would say. It was not heroic. It was simply human. That modesty makes his action more powerful, not less. He didn't see himself as exceptional, which suggests that moral courage in war doesn't require superhuman qualities, just a commitment to fundamental values that transcend nationality and circumstance. The story also highlights the cost of silence. Both men lived for decades carrying secrets that isolated them, that made their wartime experiences feel impossible to share. When they finally spoke, when they found each other and could tell the truth, both described feeling a weight lift. The reunion didn't erase the trauma of war or the complexity of their choices, but it provided validation and understanding that had been missing for nearly half a century. Today, more than 80 years after that December day, the story continues to circulate. It's shared on social media, retold in podcasts, referenced in discussions about military ethics. New generations discover it and find it speaks to contemporary concerns about morality and conflict, about how we treat enemies, about whether honor matters in modern warfare. The details may be specific to World War II, the B-17 bomber, the Messerschmitt fighter, the cold sky over Germany, but the themes are timeless. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler never sought fame. They lived most of their lives carrying a secret, and even after revealing it, they remained humble about their roles. But their story endures because it offers something essential: hope that even in humanity's darkest moments individuals can choose mercy, that enemies can recognize each other's humanity, that honor and conscience can survive war's brutality. In a world still riven by conflict, that message resonates as powerfully today as the moment it happened in the frozen sky above Bremen, when a German ace had a crippled American bomber in his sights and did the unthinkable.